Nile TV presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome to the News in Brief from Abu Dhabi TV. A number of U.S. soldiers were wounded in a landmine explosion targeting a group of U.S. transport vehicles east of Ramallah. Meanwhile, thousands of Shiites demonstrated, protesting a U.S. helicopter attempt to remove a religious flag from a communications tower in Baghdad.
A U.S. military convoy came under attack on a road leading to the city of Ramadi in western Iraq. The attack killed 6 U.S. soldiers. There were intense demonstrations in Sadr city and Baghdad protesting the killing of Iraqis by U.S. soldiers in past confrontations.
Partial electricity returned to U.S. and Canadian areas. The causes for the blackout are unknown, and New York residents have taken a holiday.
People in emergency situations like this need help. They require the assistance of policemen, firemen, and other servicemen. If we are patient, we can overcome this crisis. The important thing is to come together and work together.
U.S. authorities have arrested an Indonesian man, Radwan Asamuddin. He is suspected to be the mastermind behind many bombings, including those in Bali and Jakarta. Indonesia denies that he has been extradited there. Meanwhile, the U.S. president is pleased with his capture.
Bali was one of the world's most lethal terrorists who is suspected of planning major terrorist operations, including that which occurred in Bali, Indonesia, and other recent attacks. He is no longer a problem to those of us who love freedom.
Thousands of Liberians passed through one of the bridges in the capital Monrovia, looking for food for their families in an area controlled by the rebels. A special UN representative says that he will recommend the lifting of sanctions imposed on the former regime of President Charles Taylor. This is the end of the News in Brief. The U.S. authorities arrested Radwan Asamuddin, also known as Al-Hanbali. He is one of the most wanted members of the Jama'ah Islamiyya in Southeast Asia. The U.S. President George Bush commented on Hanbali's arrest by the U.S. authorities, saying that it is a major achievement in the war on terrorism. Al-Hanbali was arrested in Thailand, which in turn said that he has been extradited to Indonesia. The Indonesian authorities, however, denied this news. In light of his arrest, Thailand announced that it will tighten its security measures for the Pacific Rim Organization's conference in October. Al-Hanbali, or the Indonesian citizen Radwan Asamuddin, has been captured after months of pursuit. Everyone welcomed his arrest, starting with the United States and its President George Bush, who announced the news of his capture, adding that he is satisfied with the achievements of the war on terrorism.
Bali was one of the world's most lethal terrorists who is suspected of planning major terrorist operations, including that which occurred in Bali, Indonesia, and other recent attacks. He is no longer a problem to those of us who love freedom.
Indonesia was most delighted to learn of this news.
We will continue to fight terrorism in cooperation with other countries.
Al-Hanbali is wanted in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. He is accused of his involvement in a number of attacks, including those in Bali and Jakarta. Now, he may be somewhere in Indonesia. However, the Indonesian authorities deny knowledge of his whereabouts, thus refuting statements made by Thailand's Minister of Defense, who said that Al-Hanbali and his wife, who was also stopped, were flown to Indonesia last Wednesday. Meanwhile, the U.S. ambassador refused to comment.
Indonesia does not have any agreement with the United States regarding the extradition of suspected criminals. However, this does not mean that we can't reach Al-Hanbali. There is legal cooperation between us, in addition to a global cooperation to combat terrorism.
Australian Prime Minister John Howard commented on the arrest by saying that this is a big catch and will have a positive impact on the war on terrorism. In the Philippines, they believe that Al-Hanbali's arrest is a strong blow to international terrorism and warned of retaliations from the Jama'ah Islamiyya, while calling for additional security measures. Al-Hanbali is the mastermind for the Jama'a Islamiyya in Southeast Asia and the most important link between Al-Qaeda and the group. His arrest was a result of the cooperation between a number of intelligence agencies and information given by the local Thai residents where he was arrested, in the city of Oyuhaya, north of the capital Bangkok. It was reported that his facial features have changed. He shaved his beard and underwent plastic surgery.
مئات العراقيين في المشاركة في عمليات.
Hundreds of Iraqis began participating in military training operations under American supervision to establish the basis of the new Iraqi army. U.S. officials confirmed that the new Iraqi army will receive a great amount of American support, especially after the dismantling of the previous Iraqi army. A British military team arrived in Iraq from Cyprus to participate in this training as well. Meanwhile, the Allied forces are using Saddam Hussein's thumbprints, which were found in a British molding factory, to help in his arrest.
After the U.S. dissolved the Iraqi army following the collapse of the previous regime, hundreds of Iraqis began participating in the military training operations in the northern part of the country. This training is taking place for the first time since the end of the war, with the objective of establishing a new Iraqi army.
We came here to fulfill our national duty by establishing a new Iraqi army to defend our country after the departure of the American and Allied forces. That is the main condition between the U.S. and the Allied forces.
American officials confirmed that the new Iraqi army will receive American support.
They're trained in basic military skills.
They are trained in basic military skills. They will also undergo special training, so they will be able to perform their military responsibilities very well.
John Abazayed, the chief of the U.S. Central Command in the Gulf, promised to form a new Iraqi army on the 22nd of last month. He said that the new Iraqi army would be composed of 3 divisions, each with 850 people and with a total of 7,000 soldiers, compared with 400,000 soldiers in the era of Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, the Allied forces are trying to use thumbprints of the ousted Iraqi president to narrow their search. The thumbprints were found in a famous molding factory in the Hampshire area in Britain, where the 2 arms of the Victory statue in Baghdad were made. Because Saddam was obsessed with his personal statues and sculptures that were made to illustrate his achievements, he sent his thumbprints so they could be placed on the fingers of the Victory statue.
His Eminence Sheikh Ikram al-Sabri, Mufti of Jerusalem and Palestine, head of the Higher Islamic Authority, stressed today that the Islamic Waqf Bureau is in charge and responsible of Al-Aqsa Mosque. During the Friday congregational noon prayer at Al-Aqsa Mosque, Sabri said the resumption of non-Muslims foreigners visits program to the yards and compounds of the Holy Mosque is in the hands of the Waqf and whenever it finds it convenient. His Eminence asserted the Islamic Waqf's rejection to the language of threat and interference in its affairs in an indication to statements by the Israeli Minister of Internal Security, who stated that he will allow the visit of non-Muslims to the Holy Aqsa yards starting next week, whether or not the Waqf accepts the decision. The General Mufti called on the Israeli occupation authorities to alleviate the sufferings, complications, and its blackmail against Palestinians. His Eminence Sabri, on the other hand, called for releasing all political prisoners detained inside the Israeli occupation prisons, saying that freedom and dignity are legitimate rights to each human being. The Israeli occupation authorities are still continuing tightening their siege and provocative measures against Palestinian prisoners detained inside Israeli jails and imposing strict measures against them, particularly at Asqalan prison, which witnessed a few days ago great tension emergency due to breaking into the detainees' cells, searching them, and confiscating some electrical devices and food products. Lawyer of Al Qanun Society Mahmoud Jabbarin said today in the aftermath of his visit to the said detention center 2 days ago that the Israeli Prisoners Authority is violating the main principles of prisoners' treatment who are detained inside Israeli prisons, and that Ahmad Rabah Abu Amira, who spent 15 years inside Israeli jails out of his 25-year sentence, said to the lawyers of Al Qanun that the prisons administration is escalating its measures against all the political prisoners inside the Israeli jails. Today's Israeli breaches, the Israeli occupation forces broke today into Jenin city and its refugee camp amid heavy shooting and large-scale storming campaigns into Palestinians-owned houses. Eyewitnesses said that the Israeli occupation troops arrested Chief Judge and Secretary General of the High Islamic Authority Taysir al-Tamimi after performing the Friday noon prayer at Al-Ibrahimi Holy Mosque and led him to the Jewish settlement of Kiryat Arba established in Hebron city. 6 Palestinians from Deristia and Kafr Harith towns were arrested this dawn by the Israeli occupation forces and were led to unknown destinations, reporters said. Meanwhile, the Israeli occupation forces raided the Dhahir neighborhood east of Qalqilia city north of the West Bank and shelled a 4-story house, injuring seriously Ahmed Silmi and causing severe material damages to the house. The National Committee for Facing the Apartheid Wall in Qalqilia city held this noon a massive protest in the land being raised at Ras Atiyah and Magharat Dab'a villages south of Qalqilia for protesting and rejecting the construction of the separation wall on their lands. Hundreds of landowners, residents from the neighboring villages, activists from the Israeli peace movement, and foreign solidarity movements with the Palestinian people participated in the protest.
Israel has said that it will hand control of the 2 West Bank cities back to the Palestinians early next week. Under a deal reached by Israeli Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz and Palestinian Security Minister Mohammed Dahlan, Israel will withdraw from Jericho and Qalqilia. Palestinians will also submit a security plan for regaining control of the cities of Ramallah and Tulkarm, which Israel will consider over the next 10 days. The agreement reached over the Israeli withdrawal followed Palestinian disappointment over Israel's prisoner release. Israeli buses delivered 73 freed Palestinian prisoners to checkpoints in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where they were released after a 3-day delay. But the low-key handover contrasted sharply with the scenes of joy and celebrations that marked the last transfer from Israeli jails earlier this month. Palestinian officials called the move a sham, as none of the freed men were political prisoners, and most of them were jailed for petty crimes like theft. They were also due to be freed soon anyway, and Israeli troops arrested more Palestinians in overnight raids. Leaders of Palestinian factions who linked respect of a 3-month-long ceasefire to a halt of Israeli military campaigns and a release of prisoners mocked the Israeli move. Hamas called it a gesture of bad will that left short of the group's demand of freeing all political prisoners. That sentiment was echoed on the streets as thousands of Palestinians protested in Gaza, demanding the release of all 8,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. Palestinian officials also accused Israel of arresting more Palestinians while releasing others after the Israeli army detained 9 people in the West Bank raids last night. In Qalqilia, witnesses said Israeli gunfire gravely wounded a Palestinian bystander during a raid. In Nablus, Israeli forces demolished a 3-story apartment house that was home to 15 Palestinians, leaving them homeless. Thousands of Iraqis from across the sectarian divide have blasted the U.S. occupation of their country as attacks in the center of Iraq inflicted more American casualties. 2 U.S. soldiers and 3 Iraqi civilians were wounded when gunmen fired 2 rocket-propelled grenades at a small military convoy near the town of Balad, northeast of Baghdad. Witnesses said 2 attacks on military convoys on a highway between Ramadi and Fallujah west of Baghdad had left a number of American casualties. There are also signs of surging resentment among Iraq's Shiite majority, which initially welcomed the toppling of President Saddam Hussein in April. But 4 months later, the mood has changed. Chanting "Yes for Islam, No to America," more than 10,000 worshippers held Friday prayers in open air at a street in northern Baghdad, Sadr city, where U.S. forces shot dead 1 Iraqi and wounded 4 during a protest earlier in the week. The residents vowed resistance against occupation and rejected a U.S. apology for provoking Wednesday's protest after a U.S. helicopter tore a banner of a religious school revered by Shiites. A day after the UN Security Council adopted a resolution that welcomed the creation of Baghdad's new governing council, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called for a bigger role for the world body. He ruled out an imminent second resolution on the deployment of multi-international forces, but said the Security Council was at an early stage of discussing a bigger involvement of the international community in post-war Iraq.
Have encouraged an early end of the occupation, indicating that there should be a roadmap that makes it clear to the Iraqis when the occupation will end, and a fully recognized Iraqi government, internationally recognized, will be formed. Yes, there are discussions among member states that the process should be much more internationalized and that the UN should play a greater role, including possibly the UN Security Council authorizing a multinational force to help stabilize Iraq. These discussions are at early stages yet, and I do not see a second resolution on that for some time.
Annan also ruled out a French veto over lifting sanctions on Libya, which would derail a $2.7 billion deal to settle claims over the 1988 Lockerbie bombing. The UN is awaiting a letter from Libya in which it would accept responsibility for the mid-air bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Scotland that killed 270 people. The French Foreign Ministry said that in the interest of fairness, it would like a complementary settlement for families of the victims of a 1989 attack on French UTA aircraft, which was blamed on Libya. France has not said whether that it would go as far as vetoing the lifting of sanctions in the Lockerbie deal, but U.S. officials said France made the veto threat privately. On the eve of India's Independence Day, more than 30 people have been killed in bomb blasts and shootouts. In 2 incidents in the volatile state of Tripura, armed militants fired indiscriminately, killing 25 people. In neighboring Manipur state, police said a remote-controlled bomb went off just as a bus was crossing a bridge, killing 6 passengers and wounding 13. At least 19 others injured in the 2 incidents were admitted to hospital. Police have blamed either the Al Tripura Tiger Force or the Nationalist Liberation Front for the attacks. The rebel groups fighting for a separate homeland for tribal people have called for a boycott of Independence Day celebrations, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers, police, and commandos are on high alert across India, including the disputed region of Kashmir, to ward off any attacks.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair's closest aide, Alastair Campbell, has been called to give evidence before an inquiry into the death of a government arms expert at the center of a row over Iraq's weapons claims. Senior Judge Brian Hutton will hear next week from Blair's other top aides and advisors as he probes the circumstances leading up to the death of David Kelly, a former UN weapons inspector in Iraq. BBC claims that London embellished the dossier on Iraq's weapons arsenal ahead of the US-led war in March, and the suspected suicide of Kelly have triggered a political crisis for Blair who is suffering in the British polls. The Prime Minister is due to be summoned to give evidence at some stage before the Hutton inquiry, along with British Defence Secretary Jeff Hume. A BBC Defence correspondent had said that a senior British official, later confirmed to be Kelly, had told him the government's September dossier on Iraq was sexed up against the wishes of the intelligence services. He also used a newspaper article in June to report that Campbell was responsible for inserting in the Iraq dossier the headline claim that Saddam Hussein could launch weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes. The body of the British biological weapons expert was found on July the 18th near his home west of London, days after he was grilled by 2 parliamentary committees investigating the claims against the government. Libyan Foreign Minister Abdulrahman Shalgham accused France on Friday of blackmail after Paris threatened to block an agreement on lifting UN sanctions against his country unless more money was paid to the families of victims of the bombing of a French airliner in 1989. Shalgham said that his government had made its position clear to French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin. Libya has agreed to pay out $2.7 billion to the families of victims of the 1988 Lockerbie bombing in exchange for a gradual lifting of international sanctions. But France has resisted a US-backed plan to lift UN sanctions, saying that victims of a later attack should also get a similar payout. US officials in Washington expressed outrage at the French reservations and said Paris had threatened to use its veto at the UN Security Council to block a resolution lifting sanctions against Libya. Families of the British victims of the Lockerbie bombing also condemned the French government's position. Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie on December the 21st of that year, killing all 259 people on board the jumbo and 11 on the ground. Humanitarian aid poured into Liberia on Friday, a day after the rebel handover of the country's main port to peacekeepers, as a top official vowed to support the lifting of UN sanctions imposed on the war-wracked nation. 2 UN vessels docked in the newly liberated port of Monrovia, besieged by rebels for weeks, carrying food and other essential items, as a plane flew into the capital's international airport with supplies donated by Washington. More details in this report.
Workers on Friday unloaded cartons from a World Food Programme ship and transported them to a warehouse in the Monrovia port, looted on Thursday by rebels before they handed over the harbour to West African peacekeepers. The cargo included high-protein biscuits and medicines. Meanwhile, a separate UN ship from the refugee agency UNHCR docked in the deep-water harbour carrying fuel, plastic sheeting, blankets and other commodities. The first aid dispatched by the US Agency for International Development also arrived Friday aboard a chartered plane. The reopening of Monrovia's port is vital to resolving Liberia's humanitarian crisis. Some 450,000 displaced people are living on the edge in the city amid an acute shortage of food, water and medicines, and countless hundreds died during the siege. UN Chief Kofi Annan's special representative in Liberia, Jack Klein, said he would recommend the lifting of sanctions imposed on the regime of President Charles Taylor, who stepped down on Monday and went into exile. Klein also said that Taylor, a brutal warlord who has been indicted for war crimes by a UN-backed court in Sierra Leone, could do great damage to the ongoing peace efforts in Liberia from exile in Nigeria. Klein described the environment in Monrovia as very fragile.
You're in a country that has had no electricity since the mid-90s, where electricity is generated by private generators, where we have no water distribution. I mean, this is a very fragile environment for the humans that live here.
Meanwhile, Liberia's second port city of Buchanan, some 120 kilometers southeast of Monrovia, is still under rebel control. Liberia's new president, Moses Blah, on Friday resumed a second day of talks with rebel leaders in Ghana to pave the way for the signing of a comprehensive peace agreement on forming a new government. Blah, Taylor's one-time vice president, is heading an interim government due to hand power to a new administration in October.
Devastating power blackout, which paralyzed a swathe of the northeastern United States and Canada, has thrown harsh spotlight on the U.S. power system weakened by fears, or rather by years of neglect. As officials searched for clues about what caused the most widespread power outage in U.S. history that shut down transport networks and forced people to walk out of buildings in cities from New York to Toronto, scholars said it pointed to a systemic failure and highlighted a decaying energy grid. Electricity was slowly flowing back to the northeastern United States and southern Canada on Friday after the worst blackout in U.S. history left some 50 million people stunned, frustrated and frightened. New York City and much of the Northeast were paralyzed for hours by the sudden power failure that hit almost simultaneously from New Jersey to Toronto. Electrically run commuter trains were stilled. Urban metros ground to a halt in suddenly darkened and eerie tunnels. Computers crashed, planes were grounded, air conditioners cut out in hundreds of thousands of homes, and businesses were left powerless and soon in the dark. In New York and other major cities, traffic lights blinked off quickly, turning the rush hour traffic to gridlock. The New York Stock Exchange, where trading had closed 11 minutes before the blackout, announced early Friday it would be business as usual later in the day. New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg quickly held a press conference to say there was no evidence whatsoever of terrorism, and President George W. Bush repeated that assurance soon afterward.
One thing I think I can say for certain is that this was not a terrorist act. I've heard reports about a lightning strike in Niagara Falls, New York, and where federal officials, of course, are investigating the veracity of that. We'll find out here what caused the blackout. But most importantly, what we now need to do is fix the problem and to get electricity up running as quickly as possible.
In the blackout zone, at least 21 power plants shut down, affecting Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Newark, and Ottawa. Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's office said lightning sparked a fire in a power plant in upstate New York near the Canadian border, triggering the blackout. But a New York Power Authority spokesman denied there had been a lightning strike at Niagara, and several U.S. officials said the cause of the blackout was not yet clear. The three main airports serving New York, John F. Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark were all closed for a few hours, but were up and running on auxiliary power by late Thursday, the Federal Aviation Administration said. Detroit and Cleveland airports also closed as a precaution, and flights in and out of Ottawa and Toronto were also disrupted. The power outage also led to the closure of 7 U.S. nuclear power plants in the affected area.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation,